The Galaxy Council ridiculed Earth's plea. Then the humans stewed up. The translator implant behind my left ear buzzed with the weight of 47 languages at once, and I walked into the chamber knowing that every being in it expected me to fail. My name is Yara Osei. I am a diplomat by training, a scientist by instinct, and a human being by the kind of cosmic accident that apparently amuses the rest of the galaxy. I had spent 14 months in deep space to reach this moment. 14 months in a retrofitted ore freighter that smelled like recycled air and old coffee, rehearsing a speech that the greatest legal minds on Earth had spent 3 years writing. 3 years of arguments, evidence, and careful language, all aimed at a single outcome: convincing the Galactic Council to stop the Vorkai Dominion from erasing my home planet from existence. The chamber was 900 meters tall. I know because I looked it up before I walked in, because I knew that if I looked up when I entered, my legs would stop working. The ceiling was a living thing. Bioluminescent panels that shifted color with the emotional register of the room, a technology so old that no one alive knew who had built it. Right now, as I crossed the floor toward the speaking platform, those panels were a calm, indifferent blue. Around me, in concentric rings that rose toward that impossible ceiling, sat the delegates of 47 civilizations. Some had faces. Some had structures where faces might have been. Some communicated entirely through color changes in their outer membranes. All of them were watching me. I was the first human being to ever stand in this room, and I was here because the species that built this chamber, and the 46 others represented in it, had collectively decided that the death of my world was not their concern. I had 90 galactic days before the Vorkai fleet arrived at Earth. I reached the platform. It was a disk of transparent material suspended over a column of open air, positioned so that the speaker stood at the exact geometric center of the chamber, visible from every angle. A subtle intimidation, I realized. Every eye, every sensory organ, every membrane in the room could see you perfectly, and you could see all of them. You were the specimen. They were the observers. I set my data card on the podium and began. I spoke for 31 minutes. I laid out the evidence of Vorkai expansion across 6 star systems. I named the civilizations they had displaced, the populations reduced to refugee convoys drifting through cold space. I cited Article 14 of the Sentience Accords, the founding document of the Council itself, which explicitly prohibited the forced removal of a sapient species from its home world. I presented atmospheric data from Earth, the oxygen levels, the biological diversity, the undeniable signatures of a living, thinking, self-aware civilization that had been building cities for 10,000 years. I spoke clearly, I spoke calmly, I did not beg, and when I finished, the chamber was quiet for exactly 4 seconds. Then came the sound. It started somewhere in the upper rings, a vibration low and rhythmic, that I felt in my chest before my ears registered it. Then it spread. Species after species joined in, each producing their own biological version of the same response. The Keltharian delegates produced a high-frequency clicking that rattled the translator implant painfully. The Mehenu, a gaseous species contained in sealed environment suits, let their outer shells flash amber in rapid pulses. The Dreth, who communicated in subsonic rumbles, shook the floor beneath my feet. The translator implant, to its credit, gave me a single clean word for all of it: laughter. The chair of the Keltharian delegation was a being called Vas Anthari. He was 3 meters tall, ancient by any species standard, and possessed of a reputation that stretched across 4 centuries of council politics. He leaned forward from his elevated seat and looked at me the way someone might look at a very small animal that had wandered into a very important room. "Delegate Osi," he said, and the translator rendered his voice as a dry, unhurried baritone. "The council acknowledges the passion of your address. We also note, with some gentleness, that Earth is what we classify as a pre-ascension nursery world. You have possessed faster-than-light travel for precisely 11 years. Your military fleet consists of 14 vessels, the largest of which would qualify as a light courier by council standards. You are asking 47 civilizations, each older than your written history, to provoke the Vorkai Dominion, a civilization that has controlled 112 star systems for 6 centuries, on behalf of a species that most of this council only learned existed 2 decades ago." He paused. The chamber was very still. "Do you understand," he continued, "why this creates a certain difficulty?" I held his gaze. "With respect, Chair Anthari," I said, "I understand perfectly. I am asking you to do the right thing. I acknowledge that this is inconvenient." The laughter returned, louder this time. The vote came 40 minutes later, after brief deliberation in which Earth's fate was discussed with approximately the same urgency as a scheduling conflict. The result was 44 votes to table the matter indefinitely, 2 abstentions, and 1 vote in favor of Earth's petition. The single vote came from a delegate named Perel, representing the Ocean Confederation, a civilization of barely 400 million people spread across 2 marginal worlds, with no fleet, no military, and a seat on the council that most members openly regarded as a formality. Perel was small, rust-colored, and very old. When the vote was announced, she looked at me across the chamber and gave a slow, deliberate nod. I did not know then what that nod would eventually mean. I walked out of the chamber without speaking to anyone. The corridor outside was empty, which I was grateful for. I pressed my back against the wall and let myself breathe for a moment. Just breathe. The way my mother had taught me when I was 7 years old and afraid of something I could not name. In through the nose, out through the mouth, and the world does not end just because it feels like it should. Then I lifted my comm unit and connected to Earth. Commander Aiden Cross picked up on the first signal. He was a quiet man, former deep space engineer, and one of the 4 people on the planet who knew the full scope of what I was about to say. "Tell me," he said. The council said no, I told him. 44-1, they tabled it. A pause, not the pause of someone receiving bad news. The pause of someone shifting into the mode they had been preparing for. "Understood," he said. "Then we handle it ourselves." I closed the comm. Above me, through a viewport in the corridor wall, the stars were very bright and very far away, and they did not care about any of this at all. That had always been the truth of the universe. It did not care. It never had. And humanity had been living with that fact, and building in spite of it for as long as we had existed. We were not done yet. The freighter we used as an embassy had a conference room the size of a generous closet, 3 folding chairs, a wall screen held in place by 2 magnets and a prayer, and a coffee machine that had survived 4 years of deep space travel by sheer mechanical stubbornness. I had come to love that coffee machine more than I could rationally explain. It represented something. I was never entirely sure what. It was in that room, 12 hours after the vote, that Commander Aiden Cross told me the truth about my own species. He was not a tall man, not physically imposing in any way that would have impressed the Keltharian delegation. He had short gray hair, careful brown eyes, and that kind of stillness that belongs to people who have spent years in environments where panic is the most expensive thing you can afford. He had been an engineer on the Meridian Deep Station, then a project lead on the first human FTL prototype, and then, quietly and without any public announcement, the director of a program so classified that fewer than 300 people on Earth knew its name. Project Threshold. He sat across from me with a data unit in his hands, and he told me about it the way you tell someone about a thing that has been true for a long time and simply waited for the right moment to become relevant. 41 years ago, he began. When the first alien was decoded, the analysis teams found something that most people don't know about. The signal wasn't random. It wasn't a beacon or a greeting. It was a warning, one civilization telling another to stay out of a disputed zone. We decoded it by accident, and we were very careful not to announce it, because the moment we did, we would have to explain to 8 billion people that the galaxy was already divided up, that the negotiations were already ancient, and that no one had bothered to ask us. I wrapped my hands around my coffee and said nothing. The government at the time had 2 choices, he continued. They could announce contact, trigger a global panic, and spend the next generation arguing about what to do. Or they could quietly begin preparing, and let the announcement come later, when we had something to stand behind. He looked at the data unit. They chose the second option. I won't tell you it was a morally simple decision. It wasn't, but it was the one they made. Project Threshold, I said. Project Threshold, he confirmed. Hidden inside 14 different asteroid mining corporations. The budget ran through 6 separate government departments, none of which knew about the others. The engineers were recruited individually, told they were working on commercial deep space propulsion, and only brought into the full picture after 2 years of security evaluation. He almost smiled. We are a species with a remarkable talent for keeping secrets when the secret matters enough. He handed me the data unit. I looked at what was on it, and I felt the floor of my understanding shift underneath me the way the ground shifts in an earthquake. Not violently, but with the slow, irreversible quality of something enormous that will not be going back. What I was looking at was a fleet manifest, not 14 ships, not the 14 vessels that Earth had publicly acknowledged to the interstellar community. The manifest listed 261 combat-capable ships, ranging from fast interceptors to vessels that the document classified simply as heavy strategic platforms, which I understood was a careful way of saying something very large and very serious. They were not stationed near Earth. They were distributed across 19 separate deep space coordinates, each one carefully positioned to look, from the outside, like a mining operation or a scientific survey station. How, I said. It was the only word I had for a moment. 41 years of work, Aiden said, and a discovery that changed everything. He leaned forward, and for the first time since I had known him, something like pride crossed his face. Every FTL drive in the known galaxy, he said, operates on the same basic thermodynamic principle. The field equations are slightly different from species to species, but the core architecture is the same. Our engineers figured out why. It's because every civilization derived their FTL theory from the same underlying physics, and they all hit the same bottleneck. They accepted it as a hard limit, a wall you can't go through. He paused. Our people went through it. What does that mean in practice? I asked. It means our ships are faster, he said simply, not by a small margin, by a factor of roughly 3, in standard FTL, and significantly more in the burst transit mode we developed for combat situations. It also means our drives have a different energy signature. To any sensor system built on Council standard technology, our ships in transit look like natural stellar phenomena. We are effectively invisible while moving. I set the data unit down on the table very carefully. The plea to the Council, I said slowly, that was never the actual plan. It was Plan C, he said, the last diplomatic option. We exhausted Plan A 2 years ago, a series of quiet back-channel communications with Vorkai Trading partners, attempting to negotiate a buffer zone. They were not interested. Plan B was a formal complaint submitted through intermediary species to the Council's administrative body, 18 months ago. That was buried in committee without a vote. He looked at me steadily. Plan C was you, going in person, making the case publicly, so that the record exists and the Council's choice is documented. And Plan D, I said. Plan D is already in motion, he said. Has been for 6 weeks. He pulled up a star map on the wall screen. I watched as dots of light appeared across it, moving slowly, converging with the patience and precision of something that had been planned down to the hour. The Vorkai fleet will enter our solar system in 83 days, Aiden said. They are expecting to find a civilization scrambling to evacuate. They are expecting distress signals and refugee ships and the general evidence of a population in panic. He traced a finger across the map. They are going to find something else. I stared at the positions of those dots, those quiet, invisible ships moving through space like thoughts that had not been spoken yet. Were you always going to fight? I asked. He considered the question genuinely, which I appreciated. We were always going to try not to, he said. That's why you were there today. That's why the plan existed in layers. Because we are not a species that wants to fight. We are a species that fights when there is no other way, and we were very careful to make sure every other way had been exhausted first. He stood, straightening his jacket with the habitual precision of an engineer who checks twice before committing. But yes, we were always going to stand. I looked at the manifest again. 261 ships, 41 years of work hidden inside the ordinary-looking skin of a civilization that the galaxy had dismissed as a nursery world. I thought about all the engineers who had gone to work every morning in asteroid mining facilities, maintaining a secret that might never have mattered, that would only matter if the worst case came to pass. It had come to pass. And those engineers had spent 41 years making sure we were ready. I thought about the Keltharian chair, Vos Antheri, and his elegant condescension. A pre-ascension nursery world, he had called us. He had said it with the comfortable certainty of someone who had never had reason to look twice. I picked up my coffee. It had gone cold, but I drank it anyway. Tell me everything, I said to Aiden Cross. Every ship, every position, every contingency. I want to understand it completely. He sat back down and began. There were details that kept returning to me as I went over the fleet manifest for the 4th time. The interceptors were built on a frame design derived from human racing spacecraft, small, angular, with a thrust-to-mass ratio that would have been impossible if the engineers had not abandoned 3 generations of accepted propulsion wisdom and started from basic principles. The heavy strategic platforms used a modular construction method that allowed a crew of 60 to reconfigure the ship's internal layout during transit, and every single vessel carried at its core a drive unit that ran on the modified field equations that one woman named Dr. Clara Booth had written on a whiteboard in a converted mining station above the asteroid belt 16 years ago, after 18 months of work that her own team had told her was probably useless. Clara Booth was 63 now. She lived quietly on the coast of Norway and had received exactly 0 public recognition for what she had done. I made a note to myself, in the margin of my operational briefing, that this needed to be corrected at the earliest possible opportunity. The tactical architecture was the work of a retired admiral named Owen Garrett, who had spent his career thinking about how a smaller, less experienced force could defeat a larger, more established one. The short answer Garrett had reached was surprise, speed, and the willingness to act in ways the enemy had not modeled. The Vorkai were very good at combat. They had been conducting military operations for 600 years, against dozens of species, and their tactical doctrine was refined, efficient, and extremely well tested. But it was tested against species that fought in ways the Vorkai understood, species that had learned warfare from the same general tradition of interstellar conflict, with the same basic assumptions about how ships moved and how engagements developed. Humans had not learned warfare from that tradition. Humans had invented warfare independently, on a single planet, over 10,000 years, and had produced a body of tactical thought that the galaxy had never encountered. Garrett had translated that thought into the specific vocabulary of space combat, and the result was a playbook designed to be genuinely strange to anyone who had not grown up with human military history. They will expect a linear engagement, Aiden told me, pulling up a simulation. Fleet meets fleet, weapons are exchanged, the stronger force wins. That is how the Vorkai have fought every engagement for 6 centuries. They are very good at it. And we are not going to do that, I said. We are absolutely not going to do that, he agreed. We are going to do several things simultaneously that should not, by any conventional doctrine, be coordinated with each other. Rapid flanking movements combined with decoy formations, combined with targeted electronic interference, combined with direct assault on command vessels rather than frontline fighters. It will look chaotic. To anyone watching, it will look like we are making it up as we go. Are we? Partially, he said, and this time he did smile. That is actually intentional. Human pilots are trained to make real-time decisions that deviate from the original plan. Vorkai pilots follow pre-assigned tactical scripts. When the situation changes, they wait for new instructions. Our pilots adapt. That gap, the time between a Vorkai pilot waiting for orders and a human pilot already responding, is where the engagement will be decided. There was something else in the manifest that stayed with me. Every ship carried equipment for capturing Vorkai vessels intact. Boarding teams trained in the specific procedures for securing a surrendered ship without harming its crew. Medical kits stocked with information on Vorkai biology. Translation protocols for the 30 most common Vorkai dialects. We are not here to destroy them, Aiden said when I asked about it. We want them to leave. We want the ones who cannot leave to be alive and unharmed when this is over. There are 2 reasons. The first is that it is the right thing to do. The second is that live, unharmed prisoners are a more powerful message than wreckage. I understood both reasons completely. 83 days. I returned to my bunk that evening and lay down with the lights off, and I thought about the planet I had not seen in 14 months. I thought about the light in the mornings over the city where I had grown up, and the smell of rain on warm pavement, and the sound my nephew made when he laughed. I thought about all of that, and then I made myself sleep, because I had work to do in the morning, and the work required me to be present and clear-eyed. Somewhere out in the dark, 261 human ships moved quietly toward the place where they needed to be. They carried 6,417 men and women from 22 nations, who had chosen this work and trained for this moment and understood exactly what was at stake. They did not need me to believe in them, but I did anyway. The message came from the Vorkai commander at 1400 hours, station time. It was transmitted on an open channel, deliberately, because it was meant to be heard by everyone. I was in the communications bay when it came in. The translator rendered it in flat, clean English, and I listened to it twice. Inhabitants of the Sol system, the message said. This is Commander Dreth Vaughn of the Vorkai Dominion 1st Expansion Fleet. We have entered your system on schedule, and in accordance with the terms of the vacancy notice issued 90 days ago. We expected you to run. We note that you have not. We offer one final period of 20 standard hours for any remaining population to depart under safe passage guarantees. After this period, resource extraction operations will begin. Respond on this channel if you wish to negotiate your departure. Dreth Vaughn, out. They expected us to run. That detail stayed with me longer than anything else in that message. Not the casual brutality of calling it resource extraction, not the fiction of a vacancy notice, as though an inhabited planet could be vacated by receiving a document. What stayed with me was the absolute, unexamined confidence that we would simply go, pack whatever could be carried, leave, and accept that the place where everything they had ever built had stood was no longer theirs. They had done this 6 times before. 4 civilizations had run. 2 had resisted and been erased. Their ruins were now listed in Vorkai records as resource acquisition events. The Vorkai came into our solar system the way you walk into a room you already own. I was patched into the tactical channel by Aiden 6 hours later, when the Vorkai fleet had moved past the outer planets and was making its final approach. I watched through the data feed rather than a viewport, seeing the engagement as a constellation of moving data points on a 3-dimensional map: positions, velocities, trajectories, the cold mathematics of ships in space. The Vorkai formation was tight and professional. 1,200 warships in a layered battle arrangement, with their heaviest units at the center and lighter, faster ships forming a perimeter screen. It was a textbook formation. Efficient, proven, effective against every opponent they had ever encountered. They passed Jupiter. Our ships were in the asteroid belt, not hiding behind asteroids, inside them. 41 years of engineering had included, among many other things, a program of carefully hollowing out suitable asteroids and fitting them with electromagnetic dampening systems and minimal emission hull coatings. From the outside they were rocks, from the inside they were hangars. The Vorkai sensors swept across them and recorded natural mineral activity, because every sensor system the Vorkai used was built to identify ship energy signatures, and our ships, running cold inside their stone shells, produced no such signatures. I watched the Vorkai fleet move through the belt without slowing. They passed Mars. Earth was ahead of them now, blue and quiet, with no orbital defenses visible, no ships in near space, no communications of any kind. The planet looked exactly like a world whose inhabitants had refused to respond to the departure window. A world of people who had not accepted reality. The Vorkai commander sent a final signal, a declaration that safe passage had closed, a formality, because they expected no response. Admiral Owen Garrett gave a single command. 261 ships came out of their stone shells simultaneously, not from behind the asteroids. Out of them, the rock faces splitting along pre-cut seams, electromagnetic clamps releasing, drives igniting in a coordinated burn that, from the Vorkai sensor's perspective, appeared as an instantaneous materialization of an entire fleet from empty space. Because that is what it looked like. I was watching the data feed, but I heard the audio channel, the Vorkai command frequency, translated, rendered in flat English, stripped of the biological texture of their species alarm. Contact, multiple contacts. Contact bearing all sectors. Designation unknown, origin unknown. Where did they contact all sectors? Command. We have 1,200 warships, 600 years of military experience, and in the first 4 seconds of contact, the Vorkai command network was talking over itself. Our interceptors hit their perimeter screen before the Vorkai formation could respond. Not weapons, targeted electronic pulse bursts, calibrated to the Vorkai sensor architecture that our engineers had spent 3 years studying from captured equipment. The pulses did not destroy anything. They blinded. Every ship in the Vorkai outer screen lost sensor function simultaneously for approximately 40 seconds. 40 seconds is a very long time in a space engagement. Our medium strike ships moved through the gaps in that blind outer screen like water through broken glass. They were not heading for the outer screen ships. They were heading for the command vessels at the center of the formation, the ships where Dreth, Vaughn and his senior officers ran their operation according to scripts they had used 6 times before. The Vorkai inner ring recognized the threat and moved to intercept. This pulled those ships away from their assigned formation positions. The formation, designed to be impenetrable as a unified structure, began to separate. Gaps opening as ships repositioned in response to a threat, vector their doctrine had not anticipated. Our heavy platforms moved into those gaps. The engagement did not look like any space battle I had ever studied. It did not look like the orderly, geometrically precise confrontations between Council-era civilizations documented in historical records. It looked like barely organized chaos. Ships moving in directions that seemed arbitrary until suddenly they were not. Formations materializing and dissolving and reforming faster than the Vorkai command network could issue orders to answer. Garrett had been right about the gap. When a Vorkai pilot encountered a situation not covered by their current tactical script, they waited for new orders. The command network was being hit from 17 directions simultaneously, and the orders it issued were always slightly behind what was actually happening. Our pilots did not wait, they decided. Sometimes those decisions were wrong. 11 hours of engagement was not a clean process, but wrong decisions made and corrected in real time were still faster than correct decisions that arrived 40 seconds late. The outer screen broke first. Ships that had lost sensor function found themselves surrounded before their sight returned. And when it did return, the picture they saw had no script attached to it. Some held position, some turned. Turning in a space engagement is the most dangerous movement a ship can make. It presents maximum surface area to the opposition while reducing your own options. The Vorkai pilots who turned were following a protocol that said, when the perimeter is compromised, fall back to the secondary ring. It was correct doctrine for every engagement they had ever trained for. The secondary ring was already compromised. Our strike ships had been among those vessels for 3 minutes. I watched the formation collapse sector by sector, the way a structure falls when its supports are removed not all at once but in sequence, each failure creating the conditions for the next. The Vorkai were not broken by firepower alone. They were broken by disorientation, the specific difficulty of being in a situation that training tells you cannot be happening, and yet is happening, persistently, all around you. I followed the audio feeds when I could. The Vorkai command frequency was a study in escalating confusion, voices overlapping, orders being issued and then countermanded, the command network trying to find a response for something that none of its libraries had prepared it for. Our signals team had a dedicated monitor on those feeds, and the young woman running that station, a linguist named Faye who had spent 4 years learning Vorkai command protocols, kept a steady log of what she heard. I read that log afterward. It is one of the most remarkable documents I have ever seen. Not because of the chaos in it, but because of the moments of calm, individual Vorkai officers, under extraordinary pressure, maintaining their composure and trying their best to respond correctly to a situation that had no correct response in any book they had ever been given. They were, in the end, professionals doing their jobs under conditions that their training had not covered. I thought about that a great deal in the weeks that followed. At hour 3, our boarding teams made their first contact with a surrendered vessel. The ship had gone dark, the Vorkai's universal signal for standing down, and our nearest interceptor had matched velocity and sent a docking team across. Pilot Nora Sims was the first human being to step onto a Vorkai warship in a non-hostile context. She later told me, in one of the briefings that followed the engagement, that the hardest part was not the physical danger, which was real and present even in a surrender situation. The hardest part was the faces. The Vorkai crew members she encountered in that first contact were not the faceless enemy that months of preparation had trained her mind to expect. They were beings who were frightened and tired, and uncertain what was about to happen to them. One of the younger ones, barely an adult by Vorkai physiological standards, was sitting in a corridor with its knees drawn up and its head down. Nora said she had crouched next to it and said, through the translator, that it was not going to be harmed. She was not sure it understood. She stayed there for 3 minutes anyway, until it lifted its head. She told that story without any dramatic emphasis, just as a thing that had happened that she thought was worth mentioning. I wrote it down and kept it. By hour 4, 46 Vorkai ships had gone dark, not destroyed, powered down. The Vorkai signal for surrender, a protocol so old that our signals team had pulled it from a historical archive that predated human spaceflight. We responded to each one with a navigation beacon directing the ship to a holding position and a single message: stay where you are. You will not be harmed. At hour 5, the outer formation had essentially ceased to exist as a coherent military unit. The ships that had not surrendered had either scattered or pulled back toward the central formation around Dreth Vaughn's command vessel. The core group, perhaps 300 ships, held together and attempted to regroup, and I will give them credit for that. They were in a situation that had no precedent in 6 centuries of Vorkai military history, and they held their formation and tried to respond as a unit, which is what disciplined military personnel do when the situation is unclear and training is good. Our heavy platforms converged on that core group slowly and from multiple angles, and for 2 hours nothing decisive happened. The core group could not advance without running into our ships. Our ships could not close without risking a concentrated response. It was the most tense period of the entire engagement, not because of what was happening, but because of what might happen if one decision went wrong. Admiral Garrett made the call at hour 6. He sent a direct communication to Dreth Vaughn's command vessel, not a combat frequency, a diplomatic one. Translated, it said, "Commander, your outer formation has surrendered. Your central formation is surrounded. We are not looking to destroy your ships or harm your people. We are asking you to stand down. If you do, every vessel and every crew member in your fleet will be treated according to the standards we have applied to the 46 ships that have already surrendered. I give you my word on this. and you can verify it by speaking directly to the commanders of those ships right now." There was a silence on that frequency that lasted 11 minutes. Then Dreth Van responded. He said nothing about the engagement. He said nothing about the Vorkai Dominion or the resource acquisition plan, or the 6 systems they had previously cleared. He said, simply and directly, "What are your terms?" Garrett said, "Stand down. That is the only term. 4 minutes." "This engagement is concluded," Dreth Van said. "The Vorkai Dominion First Expansion Fleet stands down." I sat very still in the communications bay and did not move for almost a minute. Then I became aware that a junior signals operator named Callum had turned from his station and was looking at me. He was 24 years old, from a small town in the north of England, and he had been monitoring communications for 11 hours, with the focused calm of someone who understood exactly what he was listening to and why it mattered. Now he let out a breath he had clearly been holding for most of those 11 hours, and he looked at me with an expression I recognized because I felt it too. Not triumph exactly, but the specific feeling of an enormous weight that has been pressing down on you for so long you stopped noticing it, and has now, impossibly, lifted. "Do you want more coffee?" he asked. "I always want more coffee," I said. The final count. 60% of the Vorkai fleet had surrendered or been disabled. The rest had scattered into deep space on random trajectories, no longer attempting to regroup, no longer cohering as a military force. Earth was quiet and blue and intact, and 12,000 Vorkai crew members were sitting in their ships, waiting to find out what happened to people who surrendered to humans. Aiden came into the communications bay 20 minutes later. He looked at me without speaking, then sat down across from me. "Garrett is requesting orders for the prisoner situation," he said. 12,000 crew across 63 surrendered vessels. "They stay in holding positions," I said. "Safe and well treated, to whatever degree we can manage across that many ships. We will need them later." "For what?" "For the council," I said. He understood immediately. I watched the operational become the diplomatic behind his eyes. In a single shift of perspective. "You are going back," he said. "We are going back," I said. "All of us, with everything we have. And I am going to stand on that platform again, and I promise you, Vas Anthari is not going to laugh." Outside the viewport, Earth hung in the dark, blue and whole and entirely, undeniably still there. We had stayed. Against 1,200 warships and 6 centuries of Vorkai confidence, we had stayed, and everything that followed was going to be because of it. I walked into the council chamber the second time without rehearsing anything. The first time I had rehearsed for months. Every word placed carefully, every argument constructed with the precision of something that needed to bear enormous weight. I had been a diplomat presenting a case to a court I desperately needed to persuade. A supplicant, hoping that the right combination of evidence and language would open a door that was already closed. This time I was something different. I was not yet sure what word fit, but I knew with absolute certainty that it was not supplicant. The chamber felt changed from the moment I entered. The bioluminescent panels cycled through colors I had no names for. Something between amber and deep red, pulsing in slow, irregular rhythms. Several delegations were already at their stations when I arrived, which was unusual. Typically the council filed in with formal ceremony, each delegation taking their place in a specified order. Today they were already there, and they were watching me cross the floor, and not one of them was laughing. The emergency session had been called by 7 separate member states within 6 hours of the news reaching council space. That speed was itself significant. The Galactic Council had convened emergency sessions exactly 9 times in its 400-year history. This was the 10th. I reached the speaking platform and stood on it, and looked up at the rings of delegates rising toward that impossible ceiling, and I took one quiet breath. Vas Anthari was in his seat. He looked exactly the same as he had the first time, ancient, composed, possessed of a self-assurance that came from never having had serious reason to doubt himself. But there was something different in the way he held himself. A quality of attention that had not been there before. He was not looking at me the way a naturalist looks at a small animal. He was looking at me the way you look at something you are still in the process of categorizing and finding that it does not fit any category you already have. I had his full attention. I had all of their attention, and I had not said a word yet. 41 years ago I began, when my civilization first decoded an alien signal. The message was a territorial warning between 2 powers who had never heard of us, and never thought to ask whether the space they were dividing contained anyone worth consulting. We decoded that message in secret. We did not announce it. We began, quietly and without ceremony, to prepare for the possibility that the galaxy we had just discovered might not welcome us. I let that settle. 3 weeks ago, I said. I stood in this chamber and asked for help. The answer was 44 votes to table the matter indefinitely. I accepted that answer. I returned to our station, and then I watched as 261 ships that the galaxy did not know we had protected our home against. 1,200 of the most battle-experienced warships in the known universe. I paused. The engagement lasted 11 hours. We did not lose a vessel. We did not take a single life that was not actively trying to end ours. The 12,000 Vorkai personnel currently in our care are alive, unharmed, and prepared to testify before this council about both their experience of the engagement and their treatment afterward. I looked directly at Vas Anthari. I arranged their transport here personally. I thought this council should have the opportunity to hear from them. The silence in the chamber was a different kind of silence than I had heard the first time. It was not the silence before laughter. It was the silence of beings who were listening with everything they had. I am not here to demand anything, I continued. I am not here to threaten. I want to be very clear about that. What we did to protect our home, and when the threat was over, we stopped. The Vorkai ships that surrendered are intact. Their crews are healthy. That was a choice we made before the first ship left our solar system. And we made it not because it was tactically obvious, but because we decided, a long time ago, what kind of species we intended to be. I looked around the chamber, at the delegates, the blinking membranes, the environment suits, the ancient faces and the sensor arrays that served as eyes for beings without eyes. Every civilization in this room became great through some combination of time and effort and fortunate circumstance, I said. We do not begrudge any of you that. But greatness, in the absence of responsibility, is just power with no purpose. The sentience accords exist because someone in this council's history believed that being powerful was not the same as being right, and wrote that belief into law. I paused. The law has no teeth, we are offering to be the teeth. I laid out the proposal then, specific, detailed, the result of weeks of careful work by our legal and diplomatic teams. Human ships would enforce the accords under council oversight, with transparent reporting and clear boundaries. In exchange, the accords would be rewritten with a mandatory response mechanism. No more tabling, no more abstentions when a sapient species was in danger of being erased. In exchange, Earth would share the drive equations that Clara Booth had written on a whiteboard 16 years ago. Not the ships, not the weapons. The knowledge, the open, freely given scientific discovery that had allowed our people to break through a wall that every other civilization had accepted as permanent. I paused after that last part to let it settle, because that was the detail that I knew would land differently than anything else. The drive equations were worth more than 261 ships. They were worth more than the entire engagement we had just won. They represented a generation of physics ahead of anything the Council had, and we were proposing to give them away freely, to every member civilization, without restriction. In any previous era of galactic politics, a discovery of that magnitude would have been a weapon, a bargaining chip, a source of leverage to be stretched across decades of negotiation. We were putting it on the table on the first day. I watched the delegates process this. I watched it move through the chamber like a current, delegate to delegate, species to species, the same realization passing from one set of sensory organs to the next. They were not looking at a species that wanted power. They were looking at a species that wanted partnership. Those are not the same thing. And every civilization in that chamber had lived long enough to know the difference. We ask, I said, only that this council become the institution it always claimed to be. The Vorkai ambassador made his formal objection before deliberations began. He was a large being, gray-skinned, and possessed of the practiced composure of a representative whose civilization had simply never before needed to operate from a position of disadvantage. He rose and addressed the chamber with the measured authority of 6 centuries of dominion influence behind him. He argued that Earth had committed an act of aggression against a sovereign military operation operating within its legal rights under interstellar law. He argued that the capture of Vorkai personnel without formal declaration of war was a violation of the Sentience Accords. He argued that the Council should not allow itself to be coerced by the sudden appearance of military capability that Earth had concealed from the interstellar community for 4 decades. He argued with genuine skill that rewarding deception and coercion would set a precedent that would destabilize the entire framework the Council had spent 4 centuries building. It was a good argument, well-constructed, coherent, delivered with exactly the right tone of principled concern rather than self-interest. If I had not known the facts of the matter, it might have persuaded me. The Council's legal committee addressed each point methodically. On the question of aggression, the committee produced the original documentation of Earth's petition, submitted and voted on 3 weeks earlier. They noted that the petition had requested protection under Article 14 of the Sentience Accords, that this protection had been formally denied by a vote of 44-1, and that in the absence of Council protection, the petitioning species retained the right to lawful self-defense under the same article. The Vorkai ambassador's objection, therefore, relied on a reading of the Accords that would simultaneously deny Earth protection and deny Earth the right to protect itself. A reading that the committee assessed as inconsistent with the document's original intent and incompatible with the principle of sentient rights it had been written to establish. On the question of the captured personnel, the committee reviewed the voluntary depositions of 3 Vorkai crew members who had already provided testimony. All 3 reported that they had been treated according to standards consistent with or exceeding those specified in the Sentience Accords. 1 had received medical attention for an injury sustained during the engagement itself, before the surrender. The committee found no violation. On the question of concealed capability, the committee noted that no provision of the Sentience Accords or any other ratified Council document required a member species to disclose the full extent of its technological development to the general interstellar community. The Vorkai Dominion's own capability assessments, the committee observed, had never been submitted for independent verification. The Vorkai ambassador said nothing to this last point. He had run his argument to its end, and the argument had nowhere left to go. The deliberation lasted 4 hours. I was escorted to a waiting room outside the chamber, a well-appointed space with actual furniture, and a long window overlooking a garden that the Council's administrative staff maintained with obvious care. It was a small garden, really just a courtyard, but it contained plants from at least a dozen different worlds, growing alongside each other in what had clearly been a carefully managed arrangement. Different soil amendments in different sections, different light panels above each cluster. A great deal of quiet, ongoing work by people who had decided that the effort was worth it. I sat by that window for 4 hours and watched the garden and thought about nothing specific, which a discipline I had worked hard to develop over the years, and which has never served me better than it did that afternoon. At one point, a small being from the administrative staff came in with a tray that held a cup of something warm. It placed the tray on the table beside me and left without speaking. I picked up the cup. Whatever was in it was not coffee. It was something else entirely, something I did not have a name for, that tasted faintly of minerals and something sweet underneath. I drank all of it. It was very good. The small kindness of that cup, in the middle of those 4 hours, was something I still think about. When I was brought back into the chamber, the senior administrative officer read the result in a voice that carried to every corner of that 900-meter space. 46 in favor, 1 opposed. The Vorkai delegation voted against. Every other member of the Galactic Council voted for. When the result was announced, there was no laughter. There was that sound again, the one I had heard briefly after my proposal, that frequency the translator implant could not map to any human word. I let it hear more of it this time, a full several seconds, and asked it to refine its translation. It offered 2 options: recognition, and the alternative possibility of something it rendered as the sound a long question makes when it finally receives its answer. Both felt accurate. Voss Anthony descended from his elevated seat. I was told afterward, by 3 separate sources, that this had not happened in 30 years of council sessions. He crossed the chamber floor, the full length of it, slowly, with the deliberate pace of someone who was making a statement with every step, and stopped in front of me on the speaking platform. He was 3 meters tall. I am considerably less than that. He looked at me for a long moment. Whatever he was thinking, he did not put it into words. Instead, he simply moved aside, a small shift, just enough to clear my path to the center of the chamber. It was the kind of gesture that has no rule attached to it, and therefore means exactly what the person making it intends it to mean. Nothing more and nothing less. He intended it to mean, "You belong here." I thought about saying something. I found I had nothing, so I nodded. And he nodded, and we left it at that, and it was exactly enough. Afterward, several council members approached me individually with questions, observations, requests for follow-up meetings. I answered as many as I could and noted the rest for our diplomatic team. The chamber was alive with a kind of energy that I had not felt during my first visit. Not the comfortable energy of a body conducting its ordinary business, but something more awake, more present, the specific feeling of an institution that has just been reminded of its own original purpose. I found that I was glad, Not for us, or not only for us, for them, for the possibility that what we had demonstrated might do something useful to this 400-year-old body of beings who had the power to do so much good and had been, for reasons that were understandable and also insufficient, doing rather less of it than they might. Perel found me in the corridor when the formal session had ended. She was small and rust-colored, and she moved with the careful, deliberate pace of someone who had lived a very long time and was not in any hurry to waste what remained. She stopped in front of me and looked up with dark, steady eyes. "I voted for you," she said, "because I did not believe you would survive. I voted for you because I thought someone should be recorded as having done the right thing, even when the outcome appeared decided." A pause. "I find that I was wrong about the outcome." "I am glad you were wrong," I said. "So am I," she said, and she went on her way. A year is not very long, measured against the history of a galaxy. But a year can change enough to make the world you wake up in feel genuinely different from the world you fell asleep in. And I had spent this particular year discovering exactly how much change was possible in 12 months. I am writing this from the new human embassy station. It is not a converted ore freighter. It is purpose-built, designed by a team of architects given a simple brief. Make something that represents what we are trying to be, not what we were forced to start with. The corridors are clean. The conference room holds an actual conference. There are windows everywhere, because we are a species that likes to see where we are. There is a coffee machine that is, honestly, not as good as the old one. Some things resist improvement. My name is still Yara Ose. I have had 3 meetings this week with delegations from species that did not know Earth, existed 18 months ago, and now treat the question of their relationship with humanity as urgent. I have slept approximately 6 hours per night. I am not complaining. The Sentience Accords were rewritten over 4 months of deliberation that involved more arguments than I had expected and more genuine collaboration than I had dared hope for. The new version has binding enforcement. It has a verification mechanism, an investigation process, and most importantly, a response commitment that member civilizations are required to honor. If a species faces what we faced, the Council does not vote to table the matter. The Council acts, and human ships are the instrument of that action. Operating under Council oversight and within clearly defined guidelines, 11 patrol routes, 6 sectors, crews rotating on 4-month deployments, covering distances that would have been impossible for us a decade ago, made routine by Clara Booth's equations. Every 6 weeks there is a debate somewhere on Earth about whether the cost is worth it. The debates are loud and prolonged and occasionally very frustrating to follow from a distance. I think the debates are the most important thing we are doing. A species that has stopped questioning itself is a species about to make the kind of mistake that takes generations to correct. We have not stopped questioning. We are constitutionally incapable of it, which has always been both our greatest strength and our most reliable source of difficulty, and I have made my peace with that. 3 civilizations that were being quietly absorbed by larger powers are now formally protected under the new accords, with human ships in their systems as a visible guarantee. The absorption processes have stopped. The larger powers involved have adjusted their policies without being asked a second time, which tells me the guarantee is understood. The Vorkaika Dominion has withdrawn from the 6 systems they occupied and entered into formal renegotiation with the civilizations they displaced. This is not because they suddenly became more ethical. It is because they ran the calculation and determined that continued expansion under the new enforcement structure was no longer the low-risk undertaking it had been for 6 centuries. I have complicated feelings about the fact that calculation mattered more than conscience. I also recognize that the displaced civilizations are returning to their homes, and that is real in a way that my complicated feelings are not. The 12,000 Vorkai personnel who spent 3 months in our care are back in Dominion space. Before they left, human doctors, engineers, and cultural liaison staff had worked with them for weeks, making sure they were well, answering their questions, doing the slow and often awkward work of communicating across the barrier of 2 entirely different ways of being a living thing. Some of the interactions were genuinely difficult. A few were unexpectedly warm. A junior officer from one of the surrendered ships sent me a message 6 weeks after their return. Her name translated approximately as Morning Tide, which I found unexpectedly lovely. She wrote that she had told her family about the humans who had captured her ship, and then spent 3 months making sure she had enough to eat. Her family had found this confusing. She wrote that she had found it confusing too at first. Then she had stopped finding it confusing and started finding it interesting. She thought interesting was probably better than confusing. I replied that I agreed and that I hoped she was well. Owen Garrett retired 8 weeks after the Battle of Saul with no public ceremony and a commendation that remained classified. He went back to his home in the mountains of New Zealand and is reportedly spending his days growing vegetables and reading history. He sends me occasional short messages, no greeting, no sign-off, just a sentence or two of observation, as though the thought arose and needed somewhere to go. One arrived last week. The Vorkai ambassador used the word miscalculation in a council address. First time, progress. I read it 3 times before I replied. I am not entirely sure what I said. Clara Booth received a public commendation from the United Earth Council. The ceremony was broadcast across all channels. She stood at the podium and said, in her precise and quiet voice, that the drive equations had seemed obvious once she saw them, and she was sorry it had taken so long. The crowd laughed warmly. She looked briefly confused by this and then smiled and went back to her seat. I watched the recording 4 times. It made me very happy in a way I found difficult to describe clearly. Vas Anthuri came to Earth 3 months ago. It was not a formal diplomatic visit. It was a personal trip requested quietly and arranged with minimal ceremony. He came with a small staff and spent 4 days on the planet. I was his guide for most of it, which was one of the stranger experiences of a life that had recently become quite full of strange experiences. He was particularly interested in the ocean. He stood on a beach on the coast of Ghana, the same coast where my family has lived for generations, and watched the water for 20 minutes without speaking. The ocean on a calm morning has a quality of light that I have always struggled to describe, that blue-gray color that is not quite either of those two things, always moving, always changing, never the same twice in exactly the same way. The tide came in and went out and the sun moved across the sky, and Vas Anthuri stood very still and looked at all of it. Then he said, "You evolved beside something this large and this indifferent, and it made you brave." I thought about that. The ocean had not made us brave exactly. The ocean had simply been there, enormous and uncaring, and we had needed to learn to live beside it, and then across it, and eventually beyond it. The sky above it had not cared. The dark between the stars had not cared. Nothing in the universe had ever been interested in whether or not we survived. We had survived anyway, not because the universe supported us, but because we were stubborn enough to keep going in the face of its complete indifference. It made us stubborn, I said. Brave came later. He considered this carefully, the way he considered everything. Perhaps stubborn is sufficient, he said. It is usually enough, I agreed. We stood there a while longer, looking at the water, 2 beings from entirely different corners of existence, trying to find language for something that did not quite fit into words from either of their cultures. It struck me that this was also very human, the attempt to put into words something that resists words, and the willingness to keep trying anyway. Aidan Cross came to visit the station 2 months ago. We had dinner together in the embassy dining room, which has actual windows and actual food prepared by actual cooks, which remains a luxury that I do not take for granted. He had aged in ways that a year of decompression could not undo. There was something quieter about him now, the specific quiet of someone who has finished a thing they spent most of their life on and is not yet sure what to do with the space that used to hold it. We talked for a long time about many things, about the patrol routes and the treaty language and the challenges of enforcing a document across 6 sectors of active space, about Clara Booth's equations and what might come next for the physics team that had inherited her work, about the 3 civilizations that were now safe and the others that still needed watching. At the end of the evening, he said quietly that he thought it had turned out the way it should. I thought about that. I think it turned out the way it could, I said. Whether that is the same thing is still being decided. He nodded slowly. Then he said goodnight, and I walked back to my office, and I stood at the viewport for a while in the dark, watching the stars. There is a patrol ship visible from this viewport on most evenings. I can see its running lights from here, the warm amber of a human vessel, chosen because that color registers across a wide range of alien sensory systems, a small signal, readable by almost anyone. We are here. We are present, you are not alone. The ship passes and the stars reassemble behind it. I think about what was said in a closet-sized conference room on an ore freighter almost 2 years ago. We were always going to try not to fight. We were always going to stand. I think about the people who built 261 ships over 41 years inside hollowed-out asteroids, in secret for a moment they hoped would never come but prepared for anyway, because they could not know. I think about Callum at his communication station for 11 hours. And Clara Booth at her whiteboard for 18 months, and Owen Garrett reading human military history across a 40-year career, and asking how it applied to a kind of war no human had ever fought. I think about Perel, casting her single vote in an empty gesture of principle that turned out to be something else entirely. I received a message from her last week. She wrote that the Ocean Confederation's resettlement was complete. All 400 million of her people, on stable worlds with functioning infrastructure, supported by 6 different council members who were honoring the new commitment structure. She wrote that she had not expected to live to see it. She wrote that she was grateful and that she had heard the Earth was a very pleasant world and she hoped to visit it someday. I replied that she was welcome any time and that the ocean was worth seeing. Someone asks me sometimes whether I am proud. I still do not know how to answer simply. Pride is a word for a single person in a single moment, and what I feel is larger than that and does not belong to me alone. It is something that belongs to every person who made a quiet, unwitnessed decision over 41 years to show up to work and maintain a secret that might never matter, and to every person who flew into an 11-hour engagement because they could not imagine what they would become if they didn't. We did not stand up because we were sure we would win. We stood up because we could not picture what we would be if we didn't, and neither, it turned out, could anyone else. The stars outside my viewport do not care about any of this. They never have. They will burn for billions of years after every civilization currently seated in the Galactic Council has been forgotten, and they will burn for billions more after that, and none of it requires our notice or our approval. But I am here. We are here. The galaxy is real and we are part of it, and we are wide awake, and the rest we will figure out as we go.